My name is Simone Salas, and I will be sharing my presentation with you on women leaders as enablers in communities confronting economic, health, well-being, and participatory governance, implications of COVID-19 in Mindoro Oriental and Santa Ana, Manila. These are the contents of my presentation. There are 3 sections. The first is a brief contextualization of the project and the conversations formed. The second is about witnessing the women leaders I had the honor of interacting with. Lastly, a section is dedicated to a reflection and analysis of the interactions and how we've shaped each other as women working in development. To contextualize this presentation further, it began as a requirement for our engaged anthropology graduate class in the University of the Philippines under Professor Rosales last 2020. When the pandemic hit and we had to migrate to virtual fieldwork, Professor Rosales reached out to different leaders and contacts in development asking who needed researchers or help in gathering information on the urban and rural poor areas affected by the pandemic. This was how I was connected to former Secretary Dinky Soliman and the SNPP. So I'll talk about the SNPP a little bit more later on. The SNPP connected me to 2 of their parent leaders, Annabelle and Susana. And even after the school year and writing for Rappler with them, we continued to stay in touch over the year. In January 2021, Ms. Soliman took me in as the project officer for the CSO and Private Sector Coalition for COVID-19 Response, of which SNPP is an active partner. When we began the project, we were rooted in engaged anthropology as it was the subject we were coming from. As we proceeded, though, with our work, it started to become the necessary approach. The CSOs and the LGUs had numbers and statistics of how people were faring for the most part, but had very little information on the ground. The voices were lost in the numbers and limited mobility, and the voices were also locked in as well. Nancy Schaefer Hughes described engaged anthropology to be a womanly-hearted anthropology, veering away from the cold epistemological objective of finding the logic behind behavior and thought process towards understanding a people by engaging in and dignifying their human experiences. Before I go into the methodology, I want to talk about the women who are all stakeholders in the conversations. There's the SNPP, or the Samahan ng Nagkakaisang Pamilya ng Pantawid, roughly translated to the Association of United Families of the 4Ps program. They are a group of leaders and beneficiaries of the Department of Social Welfare and Development's Pantawid Pamilyang Pilipino program, a conditional cash grant program more popularly known as 4Ps. Now, most of the parent leaders in this group are in fact mothers, and 2 of them are Susana Noche, who lives in Calapan, Mindoro Oriental with her family. She has 2 children, both still studying, and her husband is a tricycle driver. Annabelle Luna is a Secretary General of SNPP in Barangay 770 in Santa Ana, Manila. She lives in a compound with her husband, a construction worker, and her 5 children. Of course, I am a stakeholder as well. When we use engaged anthropology approach, we acknowledge our active presence and influences as writers, as anthropologists, as researchers as well. As Schaefer Hughes says, we are not passive observers, but witnesses. Our approach to virtual ethnography was simple on paper, but posed many difficulties that were new to us and even our mentors. Majority of our interactions with our partner POs were done through phone calls. After formulating a general approach and questionnaire with my classmates and my mentor, I was able, through SNPP, to obtain the contact information of Annabelle Luna and Susana Noche. After a month of conversations, I drafted a report for SNPP and a shorter article for Rappler. I translated these into Filipino, then sent them to Annabelle and Susana, who gave their feedback to me through phone call. Since then, we've kept a regular correspondence, helping each other out with our own projects, which I will share a little bit more about later on. In our conversations, we've covered many topics, but today I will highlight 3 areas in which I got to witness their leadership. So first is the tactics to outweigh the lack of government aid and support. Next is the focus on mental health and well-being. And lastly is strategizing for the future, which both mothers have shared with me. throughout the 15-month community quarantine on all areas of the country, and the implementation of the Bayanihan Heal as One Act, which grants the president special powers to respond to the crisis, the government has increased military presence, closed a major news source, and has failed to properly distribute the social amelioration program cash grants to the listed low-income households. And these are only some of the failures. This is a quote from Annabelle where she says, "Lahat tayo ay may sikmura," or we all have stomachs. Where there was a lack in government aid, there was mutual aid and care in the communities, with military presence increased and police brutality cases happening in areas where people are not following health protocols. Parent leaders like Susana and Annabelle have been distributing sanitation kits and cautioning the youth to remain at home. They set up fund drives from their own pockets to put together bail for those jailed and are quick to connect victims to pro bono lawyers that are in partnership with the SNPP. It's important to note that these two mothers are also beneficiaries of the cash grants and therefore are considered part of the poorest of the poor of the country. Any donation they receive, whether food or monetary or even hygiene kits, they make sure to repackage these and distribute them to members of the community they know are having difficulty. The concept of a community pantry became a big trend on social media here in the Philippines among the middle class last March. But the mothers have been using this same system for the longest time, even before this became popular. It was just never publicized on social media, and if so, it was never given a name or an audience that would make it into a trend. A couple of times they felt information was being withheld from them by the local government, and they asked me to confirm with the offices. The LGU officials were more willing to answer my questions, and I relayed the information I could get back to the mothers. Particularly today, the issue is with the vaccine campaign. Now, over the past year, the mothers noticed that people have started becoming more aware of political agenda and emergency response, and thus have grown suspicious of the vaccine and the insistence of the government that the poor be prioritized. While the mothers want to support the vaccination efforts, they are hesitant to assure people of its benefits and its effectivity, since there is no assurance from the national government that they will be cared for in case the vaccine's effects are severe. One area that both mothers discussed at length, which I personally did not expect, was the pandemic's impact on mental health and well-being. Suicide incidents rose to 25.7% in 2020, with 3,529 cases of intentional self-harm. They observed that the children and teenagers were absorbing the general anxiety and the grief felt by their families and communities, and it was manifesting in severe ways like suicide and self-harm and disassociation. They also talked about the stigma of illness and the social isolation that came with being infected by the virus. Because people feared this isolation, they were less likely to report infection and comply with contact tracing or health center protocols on isolation to avoid suspicion. Lastly, they talked about their mental health as leaders and the emotional and mental burden of not only representing their communities, but taking active care in the well-being of their neighbors alongside their families. They understood the importance of letting themselves feel grief and worry, but to remain a solid pillar of strength that others could draw on. We dedicated a lot of our phone calls to ranting and crying it out so that we could all feel better. Susana and Annabelle did not only rely on tactics to address urgent matters, but have also strategized for the long term, setting down literal roots and projects they started themselves. Susana started a shared garden in her community early in the pandemic. The surrounding houses took turns to tend to the garden and could take what they needed. Other houses bartered with them for produce. Annabelle started their urban garden more recently in the public school near her home and has opened a small feeding program for her neighbors. Both mothers are also worried about the reputation of the poor, which has only worsened because of the pandemic. The poor have often been labeled as lazy and reliant on donations and ayuda. Gideon Lasco comes to mind more than ever when he says the poor are not lazy. They simply do not have the resources to become what we deem as productive, especially given the limitation on mobility since they do not have cars or permanent job positions or even reliant internet connection for meetings and online schooling. Beginning this project as a student leader, no matter how engaged I made an effort to be through our phone calls, I was still an outsider calling through the phone asking for updates. I acknowledge that this is important work, as it is the anthropologist's role to strengthen and amplify the counter narratives of people moving inside the system, especially this heavily enforced system, such as the lockdown. At the very least, we have to be agents or allies in our partners' agendas. But as Laura Polido says, writing about a community's plight or struggle should not be confused with reciprocity. And it should be a constant line of self questioning about whether we are giving back what we are taking and if we are actually helping the communities we are studying. Today, I work as a project officer for the secretariat of a coalition of orgs, of which SNPP is a part of. I actually see the mothers now in online meetings, and in many ways, my role is the same, documenting, mediating for the organizations, for community leaders like Susanna and Annabelle. In many ways, I'm still an outsider, and meeting the mothers in person might be a whole different experience that might start off as invasive all over again. But now our relationship as collaborators is stronger than ever. While working within an actual organization has helped me see the wider picture from above, my engagement with the mothers has kept me grounded in their lived experiences. More than anything, conversing and then collaborating with Annabelle and Susanna have emphasized what Schaefer Hughes quoting Carol Gilligan calls a womanly ethic of care and responsibility that engaged anthropology embodies. The two mothers themselves use the same methods of engaged anthropology without intending to as leaders, recognizing the evil of hegemonies and forming tactics and strategies to counter them, taking an active role in the community while keeping a strong sense of self and using their network to support and bolster the community's agenda. It has been such an honor bearing witness to their leadership, and I hope that it continues throughout the next years. Thank you for listening to my presentation. Again, I'm Simone Salas, and have a good day.